My husband mocked me at his promotion party. The next morning I arrived in a Rolls Royce with his boss. Caroline Whitman had spent the evening smiling while her husband, Gideon, basked in the attention of his colleagues. Everyone clapped and cheered when he was announced as the new vice president, but instead of pride in her husband's achievement, Caroline felt the familiar sting of humiliation. Gideon, in front of everyone, cracked a joke about her overly serious nature and laughed as if everyone else should find it funny too. The laughter of the room pressed on her chest like a weight. She forced a smile, but inside her heart sank. She had grown used to his subtle digs, the way he made her ideas seem silly or unimportant. At dinners with friends, at family gatherings, even at simple conversations, his words always carried that sharp edge of superiority. Tonight, though, seeing it played out in front of colleagues she barely knew, it hit differently. She felt small, invisible, like she was standing in the shadow of someone who barely recognized her worth. Walking to the car later, Caroline felt the cold night air brush against her face and imagined what it would be like to be seen, really seen, for all her intelligence and ambition. She had dreams that had been buried under years of trying to fit into Gideon's world, a world where his ego always came first. She thought of the nights she stayed awake, planning, imagining, wishing she could just prove her worth. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about being acknowledged, about reclaiming the respect she deserved. The drive home was quiet, filled with her thoughts. She replayed the party in her mind, Gideon's smug expression, the way everyone had laughed at her expense. That laughter ignited something in her, a mixture of anger, determination, and clarity. She realized she didn't need anyone's validation to know she was capable. What she did need was a chance to show Gideon that underestimating her had been the biggest mistake of his life. She spent the rest of the night making a plan, thinking of the right steps to take, the perfect way to flip the script. She thought of Edward Carlyle, a successful executive she had met at a recent business event. Edward had always treated her with respect, had listened to her ideas, and made her feel like her voice mattered. The thought of him sparked an idea, a way to make Gideon see her strength without saying a word. By morning, Caroline had transformed from the quiet, belittled wife into a woman radiating confidence. Every detail was perfect: the dress, the demeanor, the plan that would let her presence speak louder than any words. She knew that Gideon would never see her coming, that this moment would mark a turning point. As the engine of the Rolls Royce purred, she felt a thrill she hadn't felt in years, the first taste of reclaiming her life and her power. Gideon had mocked her, laughed at her, and thought he had the upper hand. But Caroline was about to show him that she was no longer invisible, and nothing would ever make him doubt her again. Caroline couldn't stop thinking about the years she had spent feeling invisible. Gideon had a way of making her dreams seem small, almost silly, without ever raising his voice. At family dinners, he would laugh at her ideas, pretending it was a joke, while everyone else smiled awkward. At parties with friends, he would dismiss her achievements, turning attention to his own stories and making her accomplishments feel like nothing. Each time, Caroline swallowed her pride and smiled, but inside she felt crushed. She remembered one evening when she had excitedly shared a new business idea she had been working on. Gideon listened for a moment, then smirked and said, "That's cute, but maybe stick to something easier." The words stung more than she let on, but she had learned long ago not to argue. She had learned to hide her disappointment and keep it inside, because fighting back only made him laugh harder. Her friends had started noticing her quietness, the way she no longer joined in conversations with the same energy. They asked if she was okay, but she brushed it off with a smile, insisting everything was fine. Deep down, though, Caroline felt the slow burn of frustration and sadness. She longed for someone to see her, to value her ideas and ambition as much as Gideon valued his own. Caroline had always dreamed of climbing the corporate ladder herself. She wanted to lead teams, make decisions, and prove that she was just as capable as anyone else in the room. She had the skills, the drive, and the determination, but Gideon never supported her. He would shrug off her goals, tell her she was overthinking things, or remind her that she should focus on home and family. His lack of encouragement made her second-guess herself at times, even though she knew deep down she was capable. The constant undermining made her stronger in ways Gideon didn't realize. She quietly learned to rely on her own instinct, to trust her intelligence, and to plan for the day she could step out of his shadow. Every dismissed idea, every belittling comment, fueled her ambition and her determination. Caroline knew that one day she would rise, not just for recognition, but to prove to herself that she was worth more than the world Gideon had tried to keep her in. Though she carried the weight of his mockery for years, Caroline also carried a quiet fire. It was a fire that whispered she didn't need anyone's approval to succeed, and that her moment would come. She just had to be patient and smart enough to take it. Caroline woke up the next morning with her mind racing. The memory of the promotion party and Gideon's mocking words still stung, But beneath the hurt was a new feeling, fury. For years, she had stayed quiet, endured his subtle digs, and let him make her feel small. But now, something inside her had shifted. She realized she couldn't keep letting him humiliate her. Not in front of friends, not at family gatherings, and certainly not in front of his co-worker. She sat on the edge of the bed, thinking about all the times she had swallowed her pride. She remembered the dinners where he laughed at her ideas, the gatherings where her achievements were dismissed, the moments when she felt invisible despite all she had done. Enough was enough. Caroline felt a surge of determination. It was time to take control, to show Gideon that she was not someone to be underestimated or mocked. As she sipped her coffee, her thoughts drifted to a recent business event she had attended. There, she had met Edward Carlyle, an executive with a reputation for being sharp, fair, and influential. Unlike Gideon, Edward had treated her with respect, asking for her opinions and listening to her ideas seriously. Caroline had been impressed not only by his success, but also by the way he made people feel valued. Thinking of him now, she realized he could be a key part of her plan, not to humiliate Gideon publicly, but to quietly and powerfully show him she was capable of far more than he had ever imagined. Caroline began to formulate her plan carefully. She didn't want revenge that would backfire or harm her career. She didn't want drama or shouting matches. Instead, she wanted subtle, undeniable proof of her worth. Proof that would make Gideon realize the mistake he had made in underestimating. Every detail mattered. The timing, the presentation, the way she would appear calm, confident, and in control. She pictured the look on his face when he finally understood that she could no longer be ignored or belittled. It wasn't about anger. It was about reclaiming her dignity and showing him that she had power he had never acknowledged. Caroline felt a quiet thrill at the thought. For the first time in a long while, she was planning something for herself, something that would put her on equal footing with him, if not above. By the time she was ready to leave the house that morning, Caroline felt transformed. The hurt and humiliation of last night were still there, but they were now fuel. Every step she took, every decision she made from that moment on would be guided by one clear goal: to take control of her life and make sure Gideon never saw her the same way again. This was no rash decision or emotional outburst. It was a carefully considered move. Caroline was determined to act, and she knew that when the time came, her plan would speak louder than any words. She would no longer be invisible, and Gideon would finally have to see her for who she really was. The morning was spent planning every detail. The goal was clear: make an entrance that would leave no doubt about strength, confidence, and sophistication. Every movement, every look, and every choice had to reflect a presence that demanded respect. Nothing could be left to chance. A Rolls-Royce was arranged not just as a vehicle, but as a symbol of quiet power. The car's polished surface and smooth lines would speak before any words were exchanged. Clothing and accessories were chosen with care, elegant, bold, and commanding attention without trying. Every detail was meant to signal someone who belonged in a position of influence. Coordinating coincidental meetings with Edward Carlyle required careful timing. Each encounter had to seem natural, ordinary even, so that anyone watching would assume no planning was involved. Every interaction would subtly reinforce competence and respect, proving capability without having to say a single word. Emotions fluctuated between a pang of guilt and a surge of determination. The guilt stemmed from the thought of manipulating perception, but it quickly transformed into focus. This wasn't about cruelty. It was about taking back control and showing worth that had long been overlooked. Every hesitation was replaced by calculated confidence, each decision reinforcing the plan. Rehearsing in the mind, every imagined scenario strengthened resolve. The reactions of others, the subtle acknowledgments of influence, and the quiet assertion of presence were all visualized. The anticipation of seeing the impact unfold created a mix of excitement and satisfaction. Every glance, every nod, every quiet word would be deliberate, sending a message that could not be ignored. By midday, every element was ready: the car, the outfit, the meetings, even the precise timing. A sense of control settled in as the plan felt tangible, executable, and flawless. There was no turning back, only moving forward with purpose. Every preparation built toward the moment when presence alone would speak volumes. Stepping into the Rolls-Royce, confidence surged. The hours of planning, the careful coordination, and the strategic thinking culminated in this instant. The day would be unforgettable, the statement unmistakable. Every choice, every detail, every calculated move ensured that the impact would be clear. A quiet, undeniable assertion of strength, competence, and respect that could no longer be ignored. This moment was not just about proving a point to anyone else. It was about reclaiming self-worth and demonstrating that control, patience, and strategy could achieve what words alone never could. The sense of power was immediate, grounding, and exhilarating, ready to turn years of silence into a commanding presence that demanded recognition. The Rolls-Royce pulled smoothly up to the curb outside a small cafe in the busy part of town. The choice of location was deliberate, one of those places where people from nearby offices often grabbed their morning coffee. Sliding out of the car with calm confidence, every step was measured and unhurried. The sound of the door closing behind was soft, but it carried weight. Inside the cafe, Edward Carlyle was already waiting. His presence was natural, as though the two of them meeting there was nothing unusual. He greeted warmly, holding the door and offering a kind smile that made the moment seem casual to anyone watching. They found a table by the window, sunlight spilling across the polished wood, and settled into easy conversation. Their words flowed smoothly, weaving through topics of work, ideas, and strategies. Edward listened closely, leaning in at the right moments, laughing softly when the conversation turned witty. It wasn't loud or showy, just two professionals sharing thoughts with ease and respect. To anyone nearby, it would look like an ordinary meeting. But for Caroline, it was anything but ordinary. Every nod from Edward, every spark of interest in his eyes, was a reminder that her intelligence mattered and that her ideas held weight. Across the street, movement caught her eye. Gideon was there, walking quickly, checking his watch, clearly late for something. His stride was brisk, his attention fixed ahead, until his gaze shifted and landed on the cafe window. The instant recognition was obvious. His steps faltered, his expression changed, and the color seemed to drain from his face. For a moment, time slowed. The sight of him standing frozen on the sidewalk, staring into the cafe, was the quiet triumph she had been waiting for. There was no need for words, no need for confrontation. His eyes said everything: shock, confusion, and the first flicker of panic. He hadn't expected this, not from her. Turning back to Edward, she continued the conversation as though nothing unusual had happened. Her voice remained steady, her smile calm, her focus entirely on the man across from her. It was deliberate. To acknowledge Gideon in that moment would have ruined the effect. Instead, she allowed him to stand there, unseen and powerless, forced to watch her from the outside. The cafe hummed with the soft sounds of morning chatter, the clink of cups, the hiss of steaming milk. Inside, the world carried on as normal. Outside, Gideon stood still, caught between disbelief and realization. Every detail had worked exactly as planned. The car, the timing, the setting, it had all led to this simple, powerful moment. No grand gestures, no raised voices, just presence. Watching his reaction, calm satisfaction filled her chest. For once, he was the one left speechless, and she was the one in control. The next step was carefully chosen. Walking into Gideon's office building, everything about the moment was intentional, yet wrapped in a casual appearance. No grand announcement, no dramatic arrival, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she stood. The receptionist greeted politely, and without hesitation she explained she was there for a quick meeting. Her tone was calm, professional, and unquestionable, so the doors opened easily. Inside the office, Gideon looked up in surprise. His eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by the sight of her standing there. He tried to cover it with his usual polished smile, but the discomfort in his expression was impossible to hide. She didn't flinch. Instead, she introduced the visit as if it were nothing more than a routine drop-in, speaking with steady ease, her presence filling the room without effort. Edward Carlyle followed just a moment later, his greeting warm but deliberate. He carried himself with the same composed authority he always had, and the room instantly shifted under the weight of his presence. Sitting together, the three of them began what seemed, on the surface, like harmless conversation about markets, projects, and upcoming opportunities. It didn't take long for the balance to change. Edward's tone, though relaxed, was filled with subtle reminders of the value he saw in Caroline. He casually brought up her insights from previous discussions, praised her perspective on strategy, and hinted at connections she could easily cultivate if she chose. His words weren't heavy-handed, but they landed with purpose. Each comment was a quiet acknowledgement of her capability, the kind Gideon had never given her. Sitting across the desk, Gideon's polished confidence started to crack. He shifted in his chair, his smile tightening as the reality unfolded before. For years he had treated her like an accessory, someone to stand quietly at his side. Now, in his own office, he watched her command the space with a calm assurance he couldn't dismiss. Every gesture, every word, reflected authority. The silence between Edward's subtle praises carried the loudest message. Gideon was beginning to see what he had ignored all along. She wasn't someone in need of validation from him. She was someone respected by men like Edward, someone who had the intelligence and presence to influence powerful conversations. For the first time, his arrogance faltered. The certainty he always carried, the smug way he dismissed her ideas, seemed to vanish as he realized just how badly he had underestimated. Watching her engage with Edward, calm and effortless, was something he hadn't expected. His world, where he was always in control, was suddenly shifting beneath him. The meeting ended with polite goodbyes, nothing dramatic, nothing loud. But the look in Gideon's eyes told the story clearly. He had seen something that shook him. The woman he thought he could belittle was standing taller than ever, commanding respect in a way he no longer could. The tension in the room grew the moment Gideon decided to make his move. His usual charm carried a sharper edge as he leaned back in his chair, trying to reclaim the control that had already begun slipping away. With a smirk, he aimed a remark directly at her, disguised as a joke but heavy with condescension. The words were meant to shrink her presence, to remind everyone who the real expert was supposed to be. Instead of reacting with anger, she remained steady. Her posture didn't change, her voice didn't falter. Calmly, she laid out the facts, each one backed by precise details. She spoke of market figures, projections, and strategies with clarity that left no room for doubt. The numbers rolled off her tongue with ease, each one carefully chosen, each one impossible to argue with. The air shifted. What Gideon had intended as a clever dismissal instead opened the door for her to prove her strength. Every sentence cut through his arrogance, exposing the difference between bluster and real knowledge. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't push too hard. She simply let her confidence and intelligence speak for themselves. Edward's reaction said it all. Though he stayed quiet, his attentive gaze and approving nods made it clear whose words carried weight. He didn't need to add anything. His silence was its own form of support. Each time she made a point, Edward leaned in slightly, showing respect without interrupting. His approval was obvious, and it only deepened Gideon's discomfort. Gideon tried to laugh it off, but the sound rang hollow. His usual audience of admiration wasn't there. He found himself cornered in his own game, forced to watch as the room gave its attention to someone he had dismissed for years. The authority he once assumed was his alone now belonged to her, and everyone could feel it. For her, the moment was more than just a conversation. It was justice. Years of being silenced, brushed aside, and laughed at had built up to this exact reversal. She felt the weight of his past mockery melt away, replaced by a deep sense of satisfaction. For once, it wasn't her being made small, it was him. The quiet triumph in her chest was undeniable. She had stood her ground without raising her voice, without needing to prove herself through force. Her knowledge, her preparation, and her poise had done all the work. Watching Gideon sit there, stripped of his usual confidence, was the clearest sign yet that the balance of power had finally shifted. The truth came out slowly, piece by piece. A conversation overheard at the right moment, a few stray documents left where they shouldn't have been, and suddenly the pattern was clear. Opportunities she had once hoped for, jobs she applied to, projects she was close to joining, had slipped away for reasons that never quite made sense. Now she knew why. Gideon had been pulling strings behind the scenes, making sure doors stayed closed to her. The realization was sharp, cutting deeper than any of his public insults. It wasn't just about jokes or dismissive comments anymore. It was about deliberate sabotage. He hadn't only underestimated her, he had actively worked to keep her from moving forward. When the time came to face him, she didn't storm in with anger. Instead, she carried herself with steady composure, holding the evidence in her hands. She laid it out on the table, each fact, each email, each record, leaving no room for denial. Her voice was calm, every word measured, her gaze steady. At first, Gideon tried to brush it off, pretending it was a misunderstanding. Then he attempted to shift the blame, suggesting he had only been protecting her or that she had misread the situation. But the excuses crumbled quickly under the weight of the truth. His confidence wavered, his polished mask slipping as he realized there was nowhere left to hide. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The power was no longer his. The more he stammered, the clearer it became who was in control. For years he had made her feel small, as if her ambitions were foolish and her voice unnecessary. Now he was the one scrambling for footing, exposed in the worst way. Inside, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: strength. The betrayal was painful, yes, but it no longer crushed her. Instead, it fueled her. She looked at him and saw not the man who had once controlled the narrative, but someone weak, desperate, and afraid of her potential. She realized in that moment that she didn't need his approval, his support, or even his partnership. He had worked against her, yet she still stood strong, maybe stronger than ever. The weight of his control was gone, replaced by a sense of freedom. Walking away from that confrontation, she didn't feel broken. She felt powerful. For the first time in years, she wasn't the quiet figure standing in the background. She was the one leading, steady and unshaken. The office door closed behind her with a soft click, and for the first time in years, the air felt lighter. She walked down the hallway with steady steps, her head held high, carrying no anger, only calm assurance. She had faced the truth, revealed it, and stood her ground without losing her composure. There was no shouting, no bitterness, only dignity. Outside the building, Edward was waiting. His eyes lit up when he saw her, and with a quiet smile, he offered words that meant more than she expected. He praised the way she had handled everything, noting how rare it was to see such strength delivered with such grace. His tone held something more, a suggestion of doors opening, possibilities ahead, a future where her voice would not only be heard but valued. The validation wasn't about flattery, it was recognition. For years, she had longed for someone to see her as capable, to acknowledge her intelligence without trying to diminish it. Hearing it now from someone who commanded genuine respect gave her a new sense of confidence, one that went far deeper than the temporary satisfaction of winning an argument. Meanwhile, back in that office, Gideon sat in silence. The man who had always carried himself with arrogance, who believed he held all the control, was left speechless. He had watched the shift happen right in front of him and had no words to undo it. The realization had finally reached him. He had spent years underestimating her, and in doing so, he had lost more than he understood. She didn't need to see his face again to know what he was feeling. The stunned quiet, the shaken pride, it was its own kind of justice. She didn't need revenge wrapped in loud victories. This was enough. The quiet reversal was more powerful than anything she could have planned. As the Rolls-Royce pulled away, she leaned back in her seat and allowed herself a long breath. Satisfaction warmed her chest. Not the kind that came from hurting someone, but from finally being seen for who she was. Respect, confidence, and strength had replaced years of silence. Her revenge wasn't in words or anger. It was in the way she rose, steady and undeniable. That rise spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. The city streets passed by in a blur as the Rolls-Royce moved steadily forward. The hum of the engine was smooth, steady, almost comforting, and every mile felt like a step further from the weight she had carried for so long. The car wasn't just transportation. It was a statement, a reminder of the strength she had reclaimed and the freedom she had earned. As she looked out the window, memories of the past tried to surface, but they no longer held power over her. What once brought pain now carried lessons. She had learned the importance of self-respect, of never letting anyone else decide her worth. She had learned that patience was not weakness, but quiet strength, the kind that allowed her to act when the time was right. And most of all, she had discovered the effectiveness of calm, strategic action, the kind that didn't shout or demand, but proved its point with undeniable clarity. There was no gloating in her heart, no need to celebrate Gideon's downfall. What mattered was how she had risen. She had faced betrayal, humiliation, and control, and turned it into fuel for her own empowerment. Every decision, every calm response, had brought her to this moment where she felt whole again. Her thoughts drifted to the future, and for the first time in years, it felt wide open. No longer tied to someone else's approval, she could focus on her own path. Professionally, opportunities waited, doors she could now walk through with confidence. Personally, there was a quiet joy in knowing she didn't have to shrink herself for anyone ever again. Independence wasn't just about leaving something behind, it was about building forward with strength. A faint smile touched her lips as the city lights flickered around her. The quiet revenge had been enough, not because it had hurt him, but because it had restored her. Dignity was intact, betrayal had been acknowledged, and the balance of power had shifted back to where it belonged. As the car carried her home, she felt light, steady, and sure of herself. The journey ahead was hers alone to shape, and that was the greatest victory of all.